The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's courtyard as Sergeant Major James Whitfield adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. 23 years of service had taught him that perfection wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. Every button gleamed, every crease razor-sharp, every movement calculated to maintain the dignity of the crown. At 45, James had mastered the art of being invisible while standing in plain sight. Tourists snapped photos inches from his face, children tugged at his uniform, and countless visitors attempted to make him laugh, flinch, or react in any human way. He stood like granite, eyes fixed on the horizon, breathing measured and controlled. But today felt different. As he took his position outside the state apartments, James noticed a familiar figure approaching across the courtyard. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the castle's head of visitor services, walked with purpose, her sensible shoes clicking against the ancient stones. Behind her trailed a small group that made James's trained eye take notice, not tourists, but something else entirely. The group consisted of an elderly woman in a wheelchair, pushed by a middle-aged man with kind eyes and work-worn hands. Beside them walked a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, carrying a small bouquet of white roses. A teenage boy brought up the rear, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, looking everywhere except at the imposing castle walls. Eleanor stopped a respectful distance from James's post and spoke in hushed tones to the family. From his peripheral vision, James could see the elderly woman's face lined with age but bright with anticipation. Her thin fingers clutched a small photograph, worn smooth from handling. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, approaching James with the deference that years of working with the guard had taught her. "Sergeant Major Whitfield, I have a rather unusual request." James remained statue-still, but Eleanor knew he was listening. She had worked with these men long enough to understand their silent language. "This is Mrs. Margaret Thompson," Eleanor continued, gesturing to the elderly woman. "She's 94 years old, and she's come all the way from Yorkshire. Her grandson Robert served with the Grenadier Guards in Afghanistan." "He was?" Eleanor's voice caught slightly. "He was killed in action 3 years ago." The photograph in the old woman's hands trembled slightly. James could see it now, a young soldier in dress uniform, the same red tunic he wore, the same proud bearing. "Mrs. Thompson's family has saved for 2 years to bring her here," Eleanor explained. "It was Robert's dream to serve at Windsor, to stand where you stand now. She wanted to see where he might have served, to feel close to him somehow." James felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the armor he had worn for over 2 decades. The elderly woman was looking directly at him now, her eyes the same shade of blue as the young soldier's in the photograph. She wondered, Eleanor said carefully, if it might be possible, just for a moment, to take a photograph with one of the guards. Not for publicity, not for social media. Just for her. Something to help her remember Robert by. Protocol was clear. No interaction with visitors. No breaking character. No exceptions. James had seen dozens of requests like this denied. The mystique of the Queen's Guard depended on their unwavering stoicism. But something about Margaret Thompson's face, the way she held that photograph like a sacred relic, made James question everything he had been trained to do. The family waited in silence. The grandfather, Margaret's son, had tears in his eyes that he was trying hard to hide. The young woman, probably Robert's sister, bit her lip nervously. The teenage boy had finally looked up, his defiance replaced by something raw and vulnerable. Eleanor started to speak again, perhaps to soften the inevitable refusal, but James made a decision that would change everything. With movements so subtle they were almost imperceptible, James shifted his weight slightly. It was barely noticeable to anyone watching, but Eleanor had worked with the guards long enough to recognize the signal. He was listening, really listening. Margaret Thompson wheeled herself closer, her son helping navigate the uneven stones. When she was just a few feet away, she held up the photograph with shaking hands. "This is my Robert," she said, her Yorkshire accent thick with emotion. "He used to say the Queen's Guard were the finest soldiers in the world. He practiced standing at attention in our garden for hours, dreaming of the day he'd wear this uniform here." James's eyes flickered down to the photograph, then back to the horizon. But, for just a fraction of a second, Margaret saw something human in those steady eyes. I know you can't break your rules, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But I wanted you to know about him. I wanted someone wearing his uniform to know that Robert Thompson existed, that he served with honor, that he dreamed of standing where you stand. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic beyond the castle walls. James could feel the weight of his position, the centuries of tradition he represented, the expectations of his superiors. But he could also feel something else, the weight of a grandmother's grief, the power of a young soldier's interrupted dreams. What happened next would be talked about in hushed tones among the castle staff for months to come. James Whitfield, Sergeant Major of Her Majesty's Grenadier Guards, did something unprecedented. With movements so careful and controlled they seemed choreographed, he stepped slightly forward. Not breaking his stance, not abandoning his post, but acknowledging the family before him in the only way he could within the bounds of duty. Then, with military precision, he executed a slow, deliberate nod toward the photograph in Margaret's hands. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained everything: respect for a fallen comrade, recognition of a family's sacrifice, and a moment of shared humanity that transcended protocol. Margaret gasped softly, pressing the photograph to her chest. Her son's jaw dropped. The young woman, Robert's sister, began to cry quietly. Even the teenage boy straightened slightly, as if sensing the gravity of what had just occurred. Eleanor quickly signaled to the family that they should step back, allowing James to return to his proper position. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already been done. As the family prepared to leave, Margaret looked back one last time at James. He had returned to his perfect stance, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, but something had changed. The rigid formality remained, but underneath it, Margaret could sense a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't respond. As the Thompsons made their way across the courtyard, other visitors began to notice something different about the guard at his post. Children who had been making faces at him moments before now approached with a strange reverence. Adults stopped trying to elicit reactions and, instead, simply observed, sensing they were in the presence of something more than mere ceremony. James remained at his post for the rest of his duty, but the photograph of Robert Thompson stayed with him. When his replacement arrived 4 hours later, James made his way to the guards' quarters with unusual haste. That evening, he sat at his small desk and began writing something he had never written before: a letter to Margaret Thompson. It would take him 3 attempts and several violations of protocol to get it right, but some things were worth the risk. The letter was brief, written on official Windsor Castle stationery, and delivered through Eleanor's careful channels. "Mrs. Thompson, it was an honor to acknowledge your grandson today. Robert Thompson's service and sacrifice will not be forgotten. A true guardsman recognizes another, regardless of where they serve. With deepest respect, Sergeant Major J. Whitfield." When Margaret received the letter a week later, she held it with the same reverence she had shown Robert's photograph. But, more importantly, she finally felt what she had come to Windsor seeking: a connection to her grandson's dreams and a confirmation that his service had meaning. The story of that day began to spread quietly through the castle staff, then to the guards themselves. It wasn't shared publicly or sensationalized, but passed along as stories of honor often are, person to person, heart to heart. James Whitfield had spent 23 years perfecting the art of being unmoved and unchanging. In 3 seconds, he had discovered something far more powerful: the art of being human while remaining honorable. And, in Margaret Thompson's small flat in Yorkshire, a photograph of a young Grenadier Guardsman sat beside a letter that proved his dreams had come true in ways he never could have imagined. The ripples of that moment were just beginning to spread, setting in motion a series of events that would challenge everything the Queen's Guard thought they knew about duty, protocol, and the true meaning of service. Word of James Whitfield's unprecedented moment of humanity traveled through the guards' quarters like smoke through ancient corridors. By the end of that week, every guardsman from the newest recruit to the most senior officers had heard some version of the story. Most dismissed it as exaggeration. Surely no sergeant major would risk his career for a stranger's photograph. But Lance Corporal David Chin had been there, standing at the adjacent post, and he had seen everything. David was 26, born in Manchester to Chinese immigrants who had built their lives around discipline and honor. His father had been a mathematics teacher, his mother a nurse, and both had instilled in him the importance of rules, respect, and never drawing unnecessary attention to himself. The Queen's Guard had seemed like a perfect fit, a place where following orders and maintaining composure were not just valued but essential. For 3 years, David had been the model guardsman. Never late, never sloppy, never showing even the slightest crack in his professional facade. His superiors praised his dedication, his peers respected his consistency, and tourists found him impressively unmovable. But, watching James acknowledge Margaret Thompson had shattered something inside David's carefully constructed world. The following Tuesday, David was assigned to the morning shift at St. James's Palace. The autumn air was crisp, painting the breath of early commuters in small puffs as they hurried past the imposing red brick walls. David took his position with the same mechanical precision he had perfected over hundreds of similar mornings. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Tourists snapped photos, children tested his resolve with silly faces and loud noises, and David remained perfectly still, eyes focused on some invisible point in the distance. Then, she appeared. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, broke away from what appeared to be a school group visiting the palace. She had wild curly hair barely contained by a bright yellow headband, and she wore a miniature version of a Grenadier Guard's uniform, complete with a tiny red tunic and a black bearskin hat that was comically large for her small head. The child marched directly to David's position with the exaggerated precision of someone who had been practicing military movements in their bedroom. She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him, snapped to attention, and executed what was unmistakably meant to be a salute. "Good morning, sir," she declared in a voice that carried across the courtyard. "I'm Emma, and I'm going to be a Queen's Guard when I grow up." David had dealt with countless children over his 3 years of service. The protocol was simple: remain motionless, maintain eye contact with the horizon, show no reaction. The child would eventually get bored and return to their group. But Emma didn't move. She held her salute with fierce determination, her small face serious with concentration. David could see her in his peripheral vision, could sense the effort it took for her tiny arms to maintain the position. "My daddy says you're the bravest soldiers in the world," Emma continued, still holding her salute. "He says you protect the Queen and you never, ever give up, even when your feet hurt or it's raining or you're scared." From somewhere behind him, David heard Emma's teacher calling her name, but the little girl didn't budge. "I practice standing still like you," she said, her voice beginning to waver with the strain of holding her salute. "In my room, I practice for hours. Mummy says I'm getting really good at it. Do you think I'm doing it right?" David felt his chest tighten. He could see James Whitfield's face in his mind, the subtle shift that had acknowledged Margaret Thompson's grief. He could feel the weight of tradition pressing down on his shoulders, but he could also see this tiny girl's fierce determination, her absolute faith in the honor of what he represented. The teacher was getting closer, apologizing to other tourists for the disruption. In moments, Emma would be pulled away, her question unanswered, her dedication unacknowledged. David made a choice that would haunt and inspire him for years to come. Without moving his head, without breaking his stance, David shifted his eyes downward to meet Emma's gaze. For just a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, he looked directly at her with an expression of unmistakable approval. Then, with movements so subtle they were barely perceptible, he adjusted his own posture slightly, correcting his stance in the same way he might guide a new recruit. Emma's face lit up like sunrise. She immediately mimicked his adjustment, straightening her tiny shoulders and lifting her chin with even greater pride. "Emma, come along now," her teacher called, finally, reaching them. But, before anyone could intervene, something extraordinary happened. The other children in Emma's group, seeing their classmates' interaction with the guard, began forming a line behind her. One by one, they attempted their own versions of a military salute, their small faces serious with concentration. David found himself in an impossible situation. Protocol demanded he ignore them completely. But, looking down at these children, their earnest attempts at honor, their genuine respect for what his uniform represented, he felt the same crack in his armor that James had experienced days before. With movements so careful they seemed choreographed, David executed a slow, precise adjustment to his own stance. To casual observers, it might have looked like a normal positional shift. But, to Emma and her classmates, it was clearly an acknowledgement of their efforts, a wordless lesson in proper military bearing. The children beamed, each one straightening their posture to match what they had observed. For nearly 5 minutes, they stood in their improvised formation, practicing the discipline they associated with the Queen's Guard. Their teacher, initially flustered by the disruption, gradually realized she was witnessing something remarkable. These 6-year-olds were learning about respect, dedication, and honor in a way no classroom lecture could teach them. When the group finally moved on, Emma broke from her line one last time. She ran back to David's position, snapped to attention once more, and whispered words that would echo in his mind for months, "Thank you for teaching me how to be brave." David remained at his post for another 3 hours, but Emma's words had fundamentally changed something in how he understood his role. He had always seen his job as maintaining tradition, following orders, representing the crown with unwavering dignity. But now he began to wonder if perhaps there was something more, a responsibility to inspire, to acknowledge, to connect with the humanity in those who looked up to what he represented. That evening, David found himself in the guard's common room with James Whitfield. The older man was reading a letter. David recognized it as correspondence from Margaret Thompson, who had been writing weekly since their encounter. "Sergeant Major," David said quietly, "I wanted to speak with you about what happened today." James looked up, his experienced eyes immediately reading the conflict in David's expression. "The little girl in the uniform?" David was surprised. "You heard about that? Word travels fast around here, son. Especially when it involves breaks in protocol." James's tone was neutral, neither approving nor condemning. "What's on your mind?" David sat down heavily, still processing the day's events. "I keep thinking about what you did with Mrs. Thompson. About whether we're doing enough, just standing still and looking impressive." James closed the letter carefully, giving David his full attention. 3 years ago, I would have told you that following protocol was always enough. That our job was to be symbols, not individuals. And now? Now I think maybe we've been so focused on representing something that we forgot we're also supposed to inspire it." James leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "That little girl today, she doesn't want to join the guard because we look impressive standing still. She wants to join because she thinks we represent something worth aspiring to." David nodded slowly. "But where's the line? How do we stay true to tradition while still being human?" Before James could answer, another guardsman entered the common room. Corporal Michael O'Brien, a red-headed Irishman with 8 years of service, looked troubled. "You two heard about the situation at Buckingham Palace today?" he asked without preamble. James and David exchanged glances. "What situation?" Michael sat down, running his hands through his hair. "Tourist collapsed right in front of the main gate. Heart attack, looked like. Paramedics were called, but..." He trailed off, clearly struggling with something. "But what?" James prompted. "Young Williams was on duty. 20 minutes he stood there, watching this man's wife crying over him, holding his hand while they waited for the ambulance. 20 minutes of watching her beg for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that her husband of 40 years was dying right there on the pavement." The room fell silent. They all understood the weight of what Michael was describing. Williams held his position, Michael continued. "Followed protocol perfectly. But, afterward, he came to me in tears. Said he felt like he'd failed at something more important than duty." James stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing. "Gentlemen, I think it's time we had a conversation about what duty really means in the modern world." Over the next hour, 3 guards who had served a combined total of 34 years began to question everything they thought they knew about their role. They talked about tradition versus compassion, protocol versus humanity, and what it truly meant to serve with honor. By the end of that conversation, they had planted the seeds of something that would grow into a quiet revolution within the ranks of the Queen's Guard, a revolution that would test every assumption about duty, challenge every rule about public service, and ultimately redefine what it meant to be a guardian in the 21st century. None of them realized it yet, but their informal meeting that night would soon reach the ears of someone with the power to change everything or to end their careers entirely. Colonel Patricia Hawthorne had served Her Majesty's Army for 28 years, climbing through ranks that had traditionally been dominated by men with surnames dating back to Norman conquests. As the first woman to command a ceremonial guard unit, she had earned her position through a combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering discipline, and an ability to navigate military politics without compromising her principles. At 51, Colonel Hawthorne commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver, was always pulled back in a regulation bun that never showed a strand out of place. Her uniform bore ribbons from 3 conflict zones where she had served with distinction before transitioning to ceremonial duties. But, on a gray Thursday morning in November, the colonel found herself facing a challenge unlike any she had encountered in nearly 3 decades of military service. The report had crossed her desk at 0800 hours, delivered by Captain Morrison with the kind of reluctant formality that indicated trouble. 3 separate incidents in the past 2 weeks, all involving guards breaking protocol to acknowledge members of the public in distress. The incidents had been minor, a nod here, a subtle gesture there, but they represented a pattern that could not be ignored. Colonel Hawthorne read through the detailed accounts, Sergeant Major Whitfield's acknowledgement of the elderly woman with her grandson's photograph, Lance Corporal Chen's interaction with the children at St. James's Palace, and, most recently, Corporal Williams's decision to subtly signal support to a woman whose husband had collapsed outside Buckingham Palace. Each incident had been witnessed by multiple tourists, several of whom had shared their experiences on social media. The stories were spreading, not as criticism but as praise. Comments flooded in from around the world, faith in humanity restored, this is what real honor looks like, the Queen's Guard showing they have hearts as well as discipline. But, praise from the public didn't address the fundamental issue. Her Majesty's Guard had protocols for a reason, traditions that had been maintained for centuries, standards that could not be bent without consequences. Captain Morrison stood at attention in front of her desk, awaiting orders. He was a good officer, mid-30s, with the kind of by-the-book mentality that made him reliable but, sometimes inflexible. "What's your assessment, Captain?" Colonel Hawthorne asked, setting down the reports. "Ma'am, it's clear we have a discipline issue that needs to be addressed immediately. These men have violated fundamental protocols. I recommend formal reprimands and reassignment away from public-facing duties until they can demonstrate proper adherence to regulations." Colonel Hawthorne had expected this response. By every military standard, Captain Morrison was absolutely correct. But, something about the reports troubled her in ways that went beyond protocol violations. "Schedule a meeting with these 3 guards," she said finally. "Conference room B, 1400 hours. I want to hear their explanations before making any decisions." Captain Morrison looked surprised. "Ma'am, with respect, explanations are rarely necessary for clear protocol violations. The regulations exist for reasons that transcend individual circumstances." "Noted, Captain. But, I still want to hear what they have to say." At exactly 1400 hours, Sergeant Major James Whitfield, Lance Corporal David Chen, and Corporal Michael O'Brien reported to Conference Room B. They stood at attention before Colonel Hawthorne's desk, their expressions revealing nothing of the anxiety they undoubtedly felt. Colonel Hawthorne studied each man carefully. Whitfield, with 23 years of exemplary service, had never received so much as a minor disciplinary action. Chen, younger but equally dedicated, had consistently ranked in the top 10% of his training class. O'Brien, while not directly involved in the incidents, had been reported as organizing informal discussions among the guards about their role and responsibilities. "At ease, gentlemen," she said finally. "I've asked you here to discuss recent events that have come to my attention. Before I make any decisions about appropriate responses, I want to understand your perspective on what's been happening." The 3 guards exchanged quick glances. As the senior officer, James spoke first. "Ma'am, we understand that we've acted outside normal protocols. We accept full responsibility for our actions and are prepared for whatever disciplinary measures you deem appropriate." "That's not what I asked, Sergeant Major. I want to understand why these incidents occurred. What was going through your mind when you decided to acknowledge Mrs. Thompson?" James hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "Ma'am, in that moment, I saw a woman who had lost her grandson in service to our country. He had dreamed of serving where I serve. It felt wrong to pretend she didn't exist, to ignore her grief and her connection to what we represent. Colonel Hawthorne turned to David. And you, Corporal Chen? What about the children at St. James's? David straightened slightly. Ma'am, that little girl had been practicing military bearing in her bedroom, dreaming of joining our ranks someday. She looked at me with such respect, such hope. I realized that sometimes being a symbol means inspiring the next generation, not just looking impressive for tourists. And, Corporal O'Brien, she continued, while you weren't directly involved in protocol violations, you've been reported as leading discussions among the guards about these issues. What's your position? Michael chose his words carefully. Ma'am, we've been talking about whether our duty is purely ceremonial or if we have a broader responsibility to represent the values we're supposed to embody. Honor, service, compassion, these aren't just words on recruitment posters. Sometimes showing these qualities requires more than standing perfectly still. Colonel Hawthorne listened to their explanations with growing interest. These weren't rebellious soldiers looking to cause trouble or challenge authority for the sake of it. These were thoughtful men grappling with the modern implications of an ancient role. Gentlemen, you understand that what you're describing essentially amounts to redefining centuries of tradition? The Queen's Guard maintains its mystique and effectiveness precisely because of our unwavering adherence to protocol. Yes, ma'am, James replied. But we've been wondering if perhaps some traditions need to evolve to remain relevant and meaningful. Colonel Hawthorne stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground, where a group of young recruits was practicing drill formations. Tell me, what do you think the public expects from the Queen's Guard in 2024? David answered carefully. Ma'am, I think they still expect discipline, honor, and dedication. But I also think they hope we represent the best of what it means to serve others. Sometimes that might require showing compassion alongside strength. And you believe this can be done without compromising the dignity of our position? Michael stepped forward slightly. Ma'am, if I may, the incidents we're discussing have actually increased public respect for the Guard. People are sharing stories about how these moments restored their faith in military service, showed them that discipline and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. Colonel Hawthorne returned to her desk, her expression unreadable. What you're proposing would require a fundamental shift in how we approach our duties. It would mean developing new protocols, training guidelines, and standards for when and how guards might acknowledge the public while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The three guards remained silent, understanding that their colonel was working through the implications of their perspective. It would also, she continued, require approval from my superiors, who may not share your view that tradition needs modernization. James spoke quietly. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to share something that might be relevant. At her nod, he continued. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman I acknowledged, has been writing to me regularly. But, more importantly, she's been sharing her story. Her local newspaper ran an article about her visit to Windsor. That article was picked up by regional papers, then national ones. He paused, glancing at his colleagues. Ma'am, the response has been overwhelming. Veterans organizations have reached out, thanking us for honoring fallen soldiers. Families of current service members have written to express their appreciation for showing that military service includes compassion. Even serving officers from other units have contacted us to say that our actions reminded them why they chose to serve. Colonel Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting that these protocol violations have actually enhanced the Guard's reputation rather than damaged it? That appears to be the case, ma'am. But, more importantly, they've reminded all of us, including these letters' authors, what we're really supposed to represent. Colonel Hawthorne sat back in her chair, processing everything she had heard. These men had given her something she hadn't expected, a compelling argument that breaking certain rules might actually serve the higher purposes those rules were meant to protect. Gentlemen, I'm going to need time to consider this situation fully. In the meantime, you'll continue your regular duties while I review options with my superiors. As the three guards prepared to leave, Colonel Hawthorne stopped them with a final question. If you could design new guidelines that balance tradition with the kind of human acknowledgement you're describing, what would they look like? James, David, and Michael exchanged glances, realizing they were being asked to help solve the very problem their actions had created. Ma'am, James said thoughtfully, I think we'd need clear criteria for when acknowledgement is appropriate, situations involving grief, service recognition, or genuine educational moments. And, we'd need subtle ways to maintain dignity while showing humanity. Specific protocols, David added, that preserve the mystique while allowing for meaningful connection. Perhaps training on how to acknowledge respectfully without compromising our role. And, guidelines that help us represent the best of military values, Michael concluded, not just military discipline. Colonel Hawthorne nodded slowly. Write it up. I want a formal proposal on my desk in 72 hours. If I'm going to defend your actions to my superiors, I'll need more than good intentions. I'll need a concrete plan for how the Queen's Guard can evolve while maintaining the standards that have made us respected worldwide. As the three guards left the conference room, they realized they had been given an unprecedented opportunity, the chance to help redefine one of Britain's most iconic traditions for the modern era. But, they also understood the stakes. Their proposal would either revolutionize the Queen's Guard or end their careers. There would be no middle ground. The task of drafting new protocols for one of Britain's most traditional military units fell to three guards who had never imagined they would be asked to rewrite history. James Whitfield, David Chen, and Michael O'Brien spent their off-duty hours over the next 3 days crafting a document that could either revolutionize the Queen's Guard or destroy their careers. They met each evening in James's small quarters, spreading reference materials across his desk, copies of existing protocols, historical records of the Guard's evolution, and stacks of letters from the public responding to their recent actions. The weight of their responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the potential to create something meaningful. The key, James said during their first session, is to maintain everything that makes the Guard special while allowing for moments of genuine human connection. David, ever practical, focused on specifics. We need clear criteria. Not every situation calls for acknowledgement. We can't have guards randomly deciding when to break character based on personal feelings. Michael, whose background included extensive study of military history, provided historical context. The Guard has evolved before. Our ceremonial role itself was an adaptation from purely military functions. We're not the first generation to face changing expectations. Their proposal, which they titled Protocols for Compassionate Service Within Traditional Framework, outlined a carefully structured approach to public interaction that respected both military tradition and modern expectations of service. The document established 3 categories of situations where subtle acknowledgement would be appropriate. Recognition of military service involved situations where family members of deceased or serving military personnel sought connection with active guards. This included veterans' families, Gold Star families, and situations like Margaret Thompson's visit. The proposed protocol allowed for minimal but meaningful acknowledgement, a slight nod, a momentary eye contact, or subtle positional adjustment that conveyed respect without compromising stance. Educational and inspirational moments covered interactions with children or groups genuinely seeking to understand military service and discipline. The Emma situation fell into this category. Guards could provide wordless guidance on proper bearing or acknowledge serious attempts at military courtesy, but only when the interaction served to inspire respect for service and discipline. Emergency human compassion addressed situations where members of the public faced genuine crisis in the immediate vicinity of guards. While guards could not abandon their posts or provide direct assistance, they could offer subtle acknowledgement of human suffering or dignity when appropriate resources were available to address the actual emergency. Each category included specific guidelines for appropriate responses, time limits for interaction, and clear boundaries that could never be crossed. The proposal emphasized that these protocols were not permissions to socialize or entertain, but structured ways to represent military values of honor, service, and compassion while maintaining operational discipline. Most importantly, the document outlined a training program that would prepare guards to make these judgments consistently and appropriately. Not every guard would be authorized for compassionate protocol duty. It would require additional training, psychological evaluation, and demonstrated mastery of traditional protocols. When they finished their draft on the third night, the 3 men sat in silence, reading through their work one final time. It's either brilliant or completely insane, Michael said finally. Maybe both, David replied. But I think it's right. James nodded slowly. Whatever happens, we've created something worth considering. Now we find out if anyone else agrees. The next morning, James delivered their proposal to Colonel Hawthorne's office. She accepted the document without comment, simply stating that she would review it thoroughly before their next meeting. What James didn't know was that Colonel Hawthorne had been conducting her own research during those 3 days. She had reached out to military historians, consulted with public relations experts, and, most importantly, had informal conversations with her superiors about the changing role of ceremonial units in the modern military. The response had been mixed but intriguing. While traditionalists expressed concern about any deviation from established protocols, forward-thinking officers acknowledged that public expectations of military service had evolved significantly in recent decades. Several pointed to successful adaptations by other ceremonial units around the world. The Canadian Ceremonial Guard had implemented similar protocols with positive results, and even the Vatican's Swiss Guard had found ways to balance tradition with appropriate human interaction. Colonel Hawthorne spent an entire evening reading through the Guard's proposal, making notes and considering implications. Their approach was thoughtful, well-researched, and remarkably sophisticated for men who had never been asked to think strategically about policy implementation. More importantly, their proposal addressed concerns she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. In an era where military service was increasingly distant from civilian experience, the Queen's Guard served as one of the few visible connections between the public and their armed forces. If that connection was purely ceremonial, impressive but cold, it might be missing opportunities to inspire and reassure the very people the military existed to serve. The morning of their next meeting, Colonel Hawthorne had made her decision. "Gentlemen," she said as James, David, and Michael stood at attention before her desk, "I've reviewed your proposal extensively. It's thoughtful, practical, and addresses real challenges we face as a ceremonial unit in the 21st century." The 3 guards remained expressionless, but she could sense their tension. "However," she continued, "implementing such protocols would require approval from levels far above my authority. The changes you're proposing would affect not just our unit, but the entire ceremonial structure of the British military." James felt his heart sink. They had created something meaningful, but the bureaucratic reality was going to kill it before it had a chance to prove itself. "That's why," Colonel Hawthorne said, her tone shifting, "I've arranged for you to present your proposal directly to the people who can authorize its implementation." The 3 guards blinked in surprise. "Next Tuesday, you'll brief a panel that includes representatives from the Ministry of Defense, the Royal Household, and senior ceremonial unit commanders. They've agreed to hear your presentation based on my recommendation and the significant public interest in recent events." Michael spoke carefully. "Ma'am, are you saying we have a chance of actually implementing these protocols?" "I'm saying you have a chance to make your case to the people who make these decisions. Whether they accept your proposal will depend on how well you can demonstrate that your approach serves both tradition and modern service expectations." Colonel Hawthorne stood and walked to her window, looking out at the parade ground where guards continued their traditional drills. "Gentlemen, what you've created goes beyond simple protocol modifications. You've identified a fundamental question about the role of ceremonial military units in building connections between armed forces and civilians. Your proposal suggests that showing disciplined compassion might actually strengthen military traditions rather than weaken them." She turned back to face them. "But you should understand the stakes. If this fails, if the panel determines that your approach compromises the dignity or effectiveness of the Guard, it won't just end your experiment, it will likely end your careers in ceremonial duty." James straightened. "Ma'am, we understand the risks. But we believe this is important enough to pursue despite those risks." "Good. Because your presentation will need to be flawless. You'll be addressing people who have devoted their lives to military tradition, many of whom will be skeptical about any changes to established protocols." Over the following week, the 3 guards prepared for the most important briefing of their lives. They refined their proposal, developed visual presentations, and gathered supporting evidence from similar programs in other military organizations. But, most importantly, they collected testimonials from the people their actions had affected. Margaret Thompson wrote a letter describing how James's acknowledgement had brought her peace and renewed her faith in military service. Emma's parents sent a note explaining how David's interaction had inspired their daughter to research military history and express interest in service careers. Dozens of other letters arrived from veterans, families, and citizens who had been moved by the guard's moments of compassion. The night before their presentation, the three men gathered one final time in James's quarters. "Whatever happens tomorrow," James said, "we've started something important. Even if they reject our proposal, we've opened a conversation about what it means to serve with honor in the modern world." David nodded. "And we've shown that following orders and showing compassion don't have to be mutually exclusive." Michael raised his cup of tea in a mock toast. "To tradition that adapts, duty that inspires, and the chance to make something better." As they prepared for sleep, none of them could predict that their presentation would not only be approved but would become a model studied by ceremonial units worldwide. They couldn't know that their compassionate service protocols would transform how military traditions evolved to meet contemporary expectations while maintaining their essential dignity and purpose. All they knew was that tomorrow, they would have the opportunity to defend an idea they believed in, that true honor sometimes required stepping slightly outside traditional boundaries to serve something greater than protocol. The future of the Queen's Guard, and perhaps ceremonial military service worldwide, would be decided in a conference room where tradition and innovation would either find common ground or prove irreconcilably different. The Ministry of Defense conference room felt impossibly formal even by military standards. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that had witnessed decades of crucial decisions. Portraits of former defense ministers lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge anyone who dared propose changes to cherished traditions. At precisely 0900 hours, James Whitfield, David Chen, and Michael O'Brien entered the room where their careers, and potentially the future of ceremonial military service, would be decided. They wore their dress uniforms, every button polished to mirror brightness, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The panel waiting for them represented the highest levels of British military and royal household authority. General Sir William Pemberton, a career officer with 42 years of service, sat at the head of the table. His withered face bore the kind of skeptical expression that had intimidated subordinates for decades. To his right sat Lady Catherine Montgomery Wells, the Queen's private secretary's deputy, whose role involved protecting royal protocols from well-meaning but potentially damaging modifications. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and she reviewed the Guard's proposal with the critical eye of someone who had seen countless attempts to modernize royal traditions fail spectacularly. The panel also included Colonel Robert Hayes, commander of the Welsh Guards, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blackwood, who oversaw ceremonial protocol coordination, and Dr. Margaret Forsyth, a military historian whose expertise in traditional military customs was internationally recognized. Colonel Hawthorne sat slightly apart from the panel, her presence serving as both support for her guards and reminder of the chain of command that had brought this unprecedented situation to the highest levels of military authority. General Pemberton opened the session without preamble. "Gentlemen, you've been given an extraordinary opportunity to present your case for what amounts to fundamental changes in centuries-old protocols. The floor is yours." James stepped forward, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Sir, members of the panel, we're here because we believe that true military tradition requires evolution to remain meaningful and effective. Our proposal isn't about abandoning protocol, it's about ensuring that our protocols serve the highest purposes they were designed to protect." He gestured to David, who activated a presentation screen showing photographs from their recent encounters with the public. These images represent moments when traditional protocol created barriers between the military and the civilians we serve. In each case, rigid adherence to existing rules prevented us from embodying the very values, honor, service, compassion, that our uniforms are meant to represent. Dr. Forsyth leaned forward, her scholarly instincts engaged. "You're suggesting that maintaining absolute stillness and non-interaction actually undermines the symbolic purpose of the Queen's Guard?" Michael answered carefully. "Ma'am, we're suggesting that in certain specific circumstances, showing disciplined compassion might better represent military values than showing no response at all. Our proposal outlines very narrow parameters for when such acknowledgement would be appropriate." Lady Montgomery Wells spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to protecting royal interests. "The mystique of the Queen's Guard has been carefully cultivated over centuries. You're asking us to risk that mystique on the assumption that showing emotion will enhance rather than diminish public respect. David stepped forward with a folder of testimonials. Ma'am, with respect, we have substantial evidence that thoughtful human acknowledgement has actually increased public respect for the Guard. These letters represent responses from veterans, military families, and citizens who witnessed our actions. He handed copies to each panel member. As they read, their expressions shifted from skepticism to interest to something approaching surprise. General Pemberton held up one letter. This is from the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. He says your actions reminded his soldiers why they chose military service in the first place. That's quite an endorsement. Colonel Hayes, who had remained silent until now, asked the question everyone was thinking. How do we ensure consistency? How do we prevent guards from making arbitrary decisions about when to break character based on personal feelings rather than professional judgment? James had anticipated this concern. Sir, our proposal includes a comprehensive training program that would prepare selected guards to make these judgments appropriately. Not every guard would be authorized for compassionate protocol duty. It would require demonstrated mastery of traditional protocols plus additional psychological and situational training. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood studied the technical aspects of their proposal. You've outlined specific criteria for 3 categories of appropriate acknowledgement. Walk me through how a guard would determine, in real time, whether a situation meets these criteria. The next 30 minutes involved detailed discussion of implementation specifics. The guards demonstrated how subtle acknowledgement could be achieved without compromising stance or dignity. They explained their decision-making framework, showed examples of appropriate versus inappropriate responses, and addressed concerns about media attention and potential abuse of the new protocols. As the presentation continued, something remarkable happened in the room. The panel members began shifting from interrogation mode to collaborative problem-solving. They weren't just evaluating the Guard's proposal, they were helping to refine it. Dr. Forsyth contributed historical examples of successful military tradition evolution. Lady Montgomery Wells suggested modifications that would protect royal dignity while allowing for appropriate acknowledgement. Colonel Hayes shared experiences from other ceremonial units that had faced similar challenges. General Pemberton, who had seemed most skeptical initially, proved to be their most valuable ally once convinced of the proposal's merit. Gentlemen, he said during a brief recess, you've done something I didn't think was possible. You've created a framework for changing military tradition without destroying it. But, implementation will require more than good intentions. When the session resumed, the panel's tone had fundamentally changed. They were no longer evaluating whether to approve the proposal, they were working out how to implement it successfully. We'll need pilot programs, Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood noted. Selected guards, specific locations, careful monitoring of results. And comprehensive documentation, added Dr. Forsyth. This could become a model for other ceremonial units worldwide, but only if we can demonstrate measurable benefits. Lady Montgomery Wells raised practical concerns. Media attention will be intense once this becomes public knowledge. We'll need clear communication strategies that explain the changes without sensationalizing them. The final hour of the session focused on implementation timeline, training requirements, and success metrics. By the time General Pemberton called for final comments, the guards realized they had achieved something beyond their wildest expectations. Gentlemen, the general said formally, your proposal is approved for pilot implementation beginning in 60 days. Colonel Hawthorne will oversee the program with support from this panel. You 3 will serve as the initial test subjects for the new protocols. He paused, his expression serious. But, understand this, success will be measured not just by public reaction, but by whether these changes actually strengthen military traditions and improve service effectiveness. If the pilot program demonstrates that compassionate protocols enhance rather than compromise the Guard's mission, we'll consider broader implementation. James, David, and Michael stood at attention, trying to process what they had just heard. Sir, James said carefully, we won't let you down. We understand the responsibility you've placed in us. General Pemberton nodded. You've shown remarkable initiative and thoughtfulness throughout this process. Now you have the opportunity to prove that your ideas work in practice. As the panel members filed out, Colonel Hawthorne approached the three guards with an expression of mixed pride and concern. "Congratulations, gentlemen. You've just changed military history. Now comes the hard part, proving that your changes were worth making." 6 months later, the pilot program's success was undeniable. Public engagement with the Queen's Guard had increased dramatically, veteran and military family support for the services had risen measurably, and, most importantly, Guard morale and sense of purpose had improved significantly. Margaret Thompson attended the formal announcement of the permanent adoption of compassionate service protocols, her grandson Robert's photograph clutched in her hands as she watched James Whitfield receive recognition for his initiative. Emma, the little girl who had saluted David Chen, was there too, still practicing her military bearing and, now officially enrolled in a youth military preparation program. The changes implemented by three guards who dared to question tradition while respecting its core values had rippled far beyond their original scope. Military academies began teaching courses on adaptive tradition. Other countries' ceremonial units adopted similar protocols. Most importantly, a generation of young people saw military service as both disciplined and compassionate, traditional and relevant. Standing at his post outside Windsor Castle, James Whitfield maintained the same perfect posture, the same unwavering gaze, the same dedication to duty that had defined the Queen's Guard for centuries. But, now, when appropriate moments arose, he could also offer the same subtle acknowledgement that had honored Margaret Thompson's grief and inspired countless others to see military service as both strong and humane. The Queen's Guard had evolved without losing its essence, adapted without abandoning its purpose, and proven that the highest form of tradition is not rigid adherence to the past, but thoughtful application of timeless values to contemporary challenges. In the end, James, David, and Michael had not changed what the Queen's Guard represented, they had simply found better ways to represent it.